Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and welcome to my astrology channel. On this occasion, I'm going to be talking about the approaching full moon, which is going to take place on the 3rd of August. But I'm also going to be talking about Mars because we are in a very Martian period. Now, the full moon of the 3rd of August is in the sign of Aquarius. So obviously it's going to be very important for Aquarians, but it's also going to be important for all the other fixed signs. So that means the sign of Leo, the sign of Aquarius, the sign of Taurus, and the sign of Scorpio. And I'll get onto that in a minute. But broadly speaking, whenever you have a full moon, it comes with a very simple theme: closure and completion. And we tend to look at the lunar cycle, the new moons, as a time for new beginnings, and a full moon as a time of endings. And in fact, I think you could almost have that as a kind of rhythm of life, because at least we can see the full moon, and as soon as we see that little waxing sickle shape in the sky, that's our new moon just beginning to wax, and it's a time to make a new beginning of some sort. And as I often say, we've got about 13 of those a year, 13 new beginnings and 13 periods of closure. But let me get on first with Mars, because this past week has really been a very Mars-full week, a very Mars-eventful week. On the 19th of July, the United Arab Emirates, they launched their first mission into space, to Mars. And this is in celebration of their 50th anniversary of their founding. So it's incredibly important that the Mars probe arrives on Mars next year, February next year, in order to celebrate that anniversary. A few days later, on the 23rd of July, China launched its Mars probe. Now, the Arab Emirates have called their mission Hope, and the Chinese have called their mission Heavenly Questions. So these are all beautiful names, intended, of course, to give us information about the surface of Mars, the climate of Mars, and in many ways, just all the kind of detail that we're accruing from this are not exactly our closest relative, but if there is one planet that offers hopes of signs of life, it's going to be Mars. Now, not only do we have these past two missions to Mars, which took off last week, but on the 30th of July, another mission is intended to launch, weather permitting, and that's by NASA. And this operation, this mission, is to be called Perseverance. And this one is specifically to look for signs of life. Now, you may think, well, isn't that odd? We've got 3 missions to Mars taking place in the space of about 10 days. Well, there is a reason for that, and it's not astrological. It's because in these sort of 10 to 14 days of this year, in the summer, the Earth and Mars become closest together in their orbit. And so this is a premium period to take off for a mission to Mars. But I have to say, astrology is in there too, isn't it? Because when we think about Mars, we think about dynamism and speed and adventure and exploration, conquering, Mars the warrior. And Mars came into the sign of Aries on the 28th of June, and it's going to work its way through the sign of Aries right through until the early part of January of 2021. So this is a massive transit. Normally Mars spends about 6 weeks in each sign, but this is a 6-month event. And it's not just about Mars being in Aries, and of course, because Mars rules Aries, it's like full-on Mars. We get all the best and worst qualities of Mars. We get all that speed, the acceleration of events. We get drive, but we also get aggravation and conflict. And the reason why, well, certainly one of the points I raised in my 6-month forecast, which a lot of you have got already, is that because Mars in Aries is going to hook up to make a square aspect, 90-degree angle to Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. All these planets are currently in Capricorn. It's going to happen 3 times. Mars is going to link to those 3 planets 3 times. And that's going to bring out the potential for that quite powerful and certainly difficult and transformational trio, which is why this next 6 months, right through until January, is going to be very eventful and conflict-ridden indeed. And I want to look at this idea a little bit more, not just about the idea of getting to Mars and all that kind of Mars energy, which we see quite literally in a space launch to Mars, but also the idea of conflict. And there are definitely an intensification of conflicts around the world at the moment. We see all the conflict taking place in the protests on the streets of America, and we've seen it in other countries as well. And given that China has just launched its rocket to Mars, it really is doing so at a time where it is very controversial and where it is aggressively seeking to gain power and influence. We see it in Hong Kong with the enforcement of the law. We see it in the overstepping of the boundary in Kashmir, heading into India, and the conflict, the deadly conflicts that have been there. We see it with the increasing of land, building those little atolls in the South China Seas and turning them into military stations. So these are all ways of asserting its power and also increasing its territory. And in this week, as these rockets took off to Mars, we had a serious deterioration in the relationships between the US, the UK, and China. So we can see this conflict really building up. So moving away from Mars and back to our full moon feeling and our discussion on the full moon. This full moon on the 3rd of August isn't alone. It's coming in a series of really, really powerful influences. We've seen Mars hooking up, making that first connection to the trio. It's hooking up to Jupiter. We have Mercury opposing Pluto. We have Mercury opposing Saturn on the day of the full moon. And we also have the Sun in a square to Uranus. So it's coming at an extremely powerful time. And what do full moons do? Brings simmering situations to the bubble. And on the one hand, we get that theme of closure, which is a good thing. We get to the end of situations, they're done and dusted, but also we can see an increase in tensions and perhaps some very unpleasant results with certain conflicts that we already see building. And we can expect, certainly in America, for there to be some very difficult events taking place in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And also this idea of August as a whole, because that is when Mars will hook up to both Pluto and Saturn. And it does that, on the 14th and then on the 24th. Uranus turns direct on the 15th. We've got a sort of month where such a lot is happening. And we can almost look at it as a whole and see that this is going to be a very decisive kind of period for international affairs. And of course, we too may have our own particular set of circumstances that come to a head. And after that point, we can make some good decisions, or we have to make, really, perhaps we have to change our course in some way. And who can forget the coronavirus? It hasn't gone away. And I think that too is going to be in the mix as we go through August, with some good progress in some areas, but in other areas, more lockdowns, more difficulty, more spiking of different cases. So it's going to be a month and a half. But let me close in a little bit more on this full moon in Aquarius. Full moons and new moons come in pairs. And we can look at that in the sense that we get a new moon and a full moon every 28 days. But I want to look at this pairing in a rather different way. I want to look at the relationship with one new moon to another full moon. And we can look at this, first of all, if we look at I want to look at the first one, which I have my note here on the 24th of January. Now, that was a new moon on the 24th of January in Aquarius, and it was squaring the planet Uranus. So this has a direct relationship with this full moon that's occurring on the 3rd of August. So on the one hand, you can look back in your own lives, especially if you're an Aquarian or a Leo, and also if you're a Taurian or a Scorpio, you can look back and see, can I link these two periods? Are events of this time have some relation to those of early August? And I want to also point out, before I look into this in a little more detail, that we have a similar pattern with the new moon of the 23rd of April and the full moon of the 31st of October. And I'll come to that shortly. Those two, new moon, full moon, are linked. They're part of a little pair, if you like. But looking at the one we have coming up, the full moon in Aquarius, I noticed that Meghan Markle has her birthday on at that time. She is a Sun Leo, and let me try to bring her chart up here. Here we go. And I think you can see, if I can get my little arrow moving here, here she is, a Sun Leo. Her birthday is actually the 4th of August, and this full moon is the 3rd, but there's only a kind of matter of hours and minutes before it really is closely on her sun. So the sun is in Leo, the full moon in Aquarius. So we have this theme really for her of the completion of a cycle. Now, if I go back to the 24th of January, when there was when we have the new moon in Aquarius, which would have been opposition her sun, but also squaring the planet Uranus. At that time, Meghan left Great Britain for good, exited the royal family, and she went to America. And in fact, Harry, of course, followed in her footsteps, and they've been pretty well there. They had a brief return in March to do some closure and completion of various things that they had to do. But really and truly, it's been 6 months since they left. So this is an important anniversary for the two of them. It's not only her birthday, but it is an assessment of just how far they've come and whether it was all worth it, what things are still not resolved, what needs to be done. But we get this theme of closure and completion, that maybe it's taken 6 months to really feel as though they have left a big chunk of their royal life behind them. But there is something else interesting going on in Meghan's chart, because Mars, as we know, is in Aries, so it's floating around here in the 10th house of her status. And her status is, of course, as a duchess, but she's also a spokeswoman. She's also an actress and a presenter. So all those things are 10th house matters. And what we have happening as Mars is going through Aries, while there might be a terrific drive to assert herself and to assert her presence on the global stage, what do we find happening? But when Mars hooks up to that trio of planets, that's Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, these are all floating around her descendant, which is the opposite point of the ascendant-descendant axis being the relationship axis. So basically, that Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter conjunction is on her relationship cusp. Now that's relationships all over the place. It's her relationships with the people she works with. It's her relationship with the world, if you like, and certainly things like the current impasse with the Daily Mail and all these other situations which have been an invasion of privacy. This is all a reflection of that Saturn-Pluto-Jupiter combination, certainly on the descendant axis, but also in square to Mars, as it will be as we go throughout August. But this also speaks volumes about her marriage, because here she is, this is the marital axis too. So I don't think there can be any question that these events and these circumstances and the things that have happened to them in 2020 have been very destabilizing to their marriage. And although that doesn't mean it's going to end, or they're not going to get through this as a team, as a team Sussex, which they are, but it certainly is a pivotal moment in their relationship, and it might well in perhaps another couple's life cause the end of the marriage with a prospect of divorce. What we want to hope for with Harry and Meghan is that their love for each other is enough to keep them as Team Sussex and to get through this difficult transitional period together. So let me come back here. So that really is an illustration of how the new moon squaring Uranus in January fits with this one coming up on the 3rd of August. So now I want to talk a little bit about the other pair, which is the 23rd of April, where we had a new moon in Taurus, and that was conjunct Uranus. We're coming up to a full moon on the 31st of October, Halloween. And here we've got the sun in Scorpio, the moon in Taurus, and the moon is conjunct Uranus. So these two periods of time are linked by their events. And so I thought to myself, well, that might be quite interesting because the 31st of October is, of course, a matter of days before the general election in America. I wonder if there's anything that could link these two events, certainly in the life of Mr. Trump, President Trump. So I went back and checked it out. And the 23rd of April was that famous press coronavirus conference where he talked about disinfecting the body, getting rid of the virus internally by injections of light or perhaps injections of disinfectant. So somehow we have a link to this period of time. And if you remember, of course, prior to that, it was believed, and certainly Mr. Trump made every attempt to get America back to normal, America back to work in the early part of April by Easter. And of course, by that time, it was clearly not going to happen because there were so many cases. And so again, we're going to be looking at the events of that period of time playing into the events of the 31st of October. And maybe some of the other things that are happening at that time are going to make a difference to his prospects in terms of winning or losing the election. What I will say about this election coming up, because it is going to be extremely controversial, and I say that with confidence because of that full moon conjunct Uranus. It's going to be powerfully controversial. This is going to be historic. The events surrounding the election and what happens during the time of that election are going to be historic. So maybe I should just leave it at that. So I should really wrap up. And I wanted to wrap up with a theme of silence. Now, this might sound like an odd subject to be drawing a conclusion to this video about, but let me explain. Silence is a very powerful thing. I mean, sometimes when we don't say something, our silence speaks volumes. We don't need to say anything, so it's very powerful. But there's also that idea that when we keep silent, we can often do an awful lot of damage. And I want to quote that famous quote, you know, all it takes for evil to triumph is for a few good men to remain silent. Now, I have to say that isn't the real quote. It's a sort of paraphrase of the quote. And I think what I want to do is read you the full quote. And I have to read it in case I get it wrong. So the actual quote by John Stuart Mill in 1867 is thus: "Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and say nothing." I think that's very profound. In fact, I think it's more profound that way than the other way. And if we look around the world and we see so many nations, so many countries, so many leaders and rulers who are really perhaps not doing the right thing, all it takes is for a few men to stand back and do nothing for them to compass their ends. And I think that's one way to look at it. But let me make it a little personal as well. Because how many of us in our own lives have remained silent for fear of upsetting the apple cart, or perhaps of losing our position? We don't want things to change so that we may have less, or we may ourselves encounter problems. We remain silent. By doing so, we allow bad things to happen. So maybe things like interventions are appropriate with this full moon. Remember, we've got a big full moon. It's coming in the center of all those powerful confrontational aspects. And the word confrontation isn't just about conflict and violence. It's about facing something, facing the truth. So this is a facing the truth full moon. And maybe by mounting an intervention somewhere in our lives where we know wrong is going on is the right thing. But I also want to say that maybe that theme of remaining silent and confrontation needs to apply to ourselves, first of all. And what is it that we're not confronting? What is it that we're not looking at and remaining silent on? And that step could be the biggest step we take to release, which of course is what Uranus is all about. We release, we find freedom and liberation, first of all, by confrontation. So thank you for watching my video, and I look forward to seeing you next time on my next video. Bye for now.